Key to life.
Hello, this is Sekou Burris, your host of The Lit Review, a podcast brought to you by the Academy of Management Journal. Every organization runs on information that flows upward, things like concerns, complaints, early warnings about things going wrong. How leaders handle that information can be the difference between catching a problem early and reading about it in the headlines. So here's a question that should matter to anyone who studies organizations or who runs one. Do we actually know how managers decide which concerns to take seriously? In this episode, I'm joined by Ethan Burris, the King Ranch Chair for Business Leadership and the James L. Bayless NSTAR Corp Chair in Business Administration at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. His new AMJ paper reveals a striking blind spot, that managers are often wrong about their own judgment, acting in ways that directly contradict what they believe they do. For researchers, it challenges a core assumption about how voice works in organizations, but for executives, it raises an uncomfortable question about how we really understand our own decision-making. I hope that you will enjoy this episode of The Lit Review and my discussion with Ethan Burris. My guest today on the Lit Review podcast is Ethan Burris, who is a professor at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. His research investigates leaders' influence on employee voice in the workplace and the impact of employee voice on personal and organizational performance. Hello, Ethan, and welcome to the Lit Review podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sekou. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. For those who don't know, Ethan and I used to be colleagues at UT Austin, and so we'll try to keep this thing professional, but we may devolve into arguments that have been, 15 years in the making. All right. I want to start, keep us on track. I want to start by discussing this recent AMJ paper entitled, Not Just Hearsay and Rumor, How Managers Actually Perceive the Credibility of Secondhand Accounts of Employee Voice. This is a paper you co-authored with Howell, Steve Stubben, and Welch. The paper takes on a really interesting question. When employees raise concerns on the behalf of others rather than themselves, do managers actually discount that hearsay the way that conventional wisdom maybe would suggest they should or not? And so really interesting paper. I think a lot of potential linkages to what we see in the news and in organizations today. But let's dive into the paper first. And so what is the empirical puzzle that kind of motivated this paper? What were you guys thinking about at the very beginning?
So I guess I'll start off with a little bit of a story about how the paper came about. And I think that we'll get to what motivated how the paper, the version of the paper that was eventually published. So Kyle Welch is the brother-in-law of a former colleague at UT, and he knew that I studied employee voice. He knew that I studied speaking up in the workplace. And he and Steve Stubben are both accounting professors, and they had access to just a beautiful data set on internal reports in organizations from the most widely used platform, certainly among the Fortune 500, but really among the Fortune 2000. And so we were talking about just the empirical context of what that is and what it means and some of the variables in the data set. And one of the things that he mentioned was, he had this finding that in this context, in the platform itself, there's a whole bunch of different codes for, not just what the ideas are that people are speaking up about, but, how it is done. And one of these things was if someone directly observes or is impacted by the issue, so it affects them, or is this something that is more of a secondhand account? And the more that he and I were talking about it, is a wonderful empirical context for it. But given that I studied voice, I sort of had the theoretical background to say, this is really fascinating that managers would end up supporting and seeing ideas as credible from those that weren't really affected by the issue at all. And for me, that kind of spurred a couple different questions. The first was do people actually believe that? Because it was kind of surprising. And if you talk to most managers, and certainly when I've done executive education or being in the classroom, people really feel like they have a good barometer on what is or is not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mostly like a function of the idea itself. It's not really a function of how that idea comes across your plate in the first place. And so, like the more that Kyle and then Steve and then eventually Taya, who's a former doctoral student, when the four of us kind of got together, it was really this contrast between what managers think they will do and what they actually do
Mm-hmm.
that was really sort of the driving factor for what eventually became the paper. And recently, I kind of start with that story of, hey, I have this cool context and this amazing data set, and both Steve and Kyle are like absolute wizards when it comes to econometrics and stuff, and certainly much more than, myself. I was trained as an experimentalist, and,
Mm-hmm.
I've done more work in the field. Like, I don't have their skill sets when it comes to those types of archival analyses. And so what kind of started with, hey, I have this kind of cool finding that we're seeing in this really cool context. Can
Mm-hmm.
you, provide some advice and whatever else? It eventually turned into, a team of academics across two completely different disciplines in accounting
Yeah.
and management, and a complementary set of skills where, they have the archival and empirical chops. Given that we're publishing this in a management outlet, I was a lot more familiar with the management theory. And then Tay and I could then complement the archival setting with a more qualitative approach to unearth some of these managerial layer theories, which I know we'll get to in a sec. And then, design some pretty crisp and I think, at least in some cases, really elegant experiments that both demonstrate the overall finding of this contrast between what managers think they'll do and what they actually do, and then some of the mechanisms that we're able to, I think, really pin down quite nicely. So, a bit of both an empirical puzzle, but to me, it's also kind of demonstrates kind of the beauty of how teams of authors kind of come together and put forward what I think is a really good paper.
Yeah, and I'm a fan of the interdisciplinary. It doesn't always work out, but it's, I think, to the benefit of everyone when you have one area that's like, this is really interesting for one reason, another area is like, hey, this is interesting for us for different reasons. Let's see if we can get together and kind of talk about it. And so there are a lot of different studies in this paper. We can't cover all of them, but let's talk about the kind of headline finding, which is this idea that secondhand reports versus firsthand reports, and the way that managers believe they would versus they actually do kind of react to them. What are the takeaways you want the readers to come away with most for this paper?
So I think in my mind, there's kind of two top headlines. The first, which I think is probably more sensationalized by, certainly the title and then some of the first set of findings, and that is, we kind of have this belief that secondhand accounts or witnesses of events should be largely ignored. And, we see this in evidence of, our legal system where hearsay, and I should have mentioned also Taya Howell is also a former lawyer. So she brought kind of that legal perspective in, which was
Yeah.
hugely important for this.
Mm-hmm.
And like these types of things that we shouldn't really pay attention to people who just hear stuff through the grapevine. Like we want to get to the actual source. We want to get to the person who directly observed was impacted by whatever events, because they would be able to provide a more complete picture, kind of speak with a lot more accuracy about the issue. But, to me, sort of the surprising finding is managers just don't do that. They, and especially in the workplace, which may be a little bit different than the legal context, like they
Yeah.
certainly pay attention to the rumors and the gossip and the other things that are going on, because they have to have a good idea about not just what ideas they need to pay attention to, but whoever else it's affecting.
Mm.
And so that sort of contrast between, like some of our really baked in assumptions about who speaks the truth about particular matters
Yeah.
versus what managers pay attention to. I think that's sort of one headline. And then the second, I think, goes to the heart of really an executive mindset, which is we sort of assume that when you see something or observe, in this case, have some ideas come across your desk, that what you think is a good idea will ultimately result in action.
Hmm.
And so this kind of the strong tie between what I believe I will do and what I actually do is quite strong.
Hmm.
And we all have theories about what sets of ideas we think we will support if they come across our desk. And in this case, again, when I talk with executives, it's to really push them to slow their thinking down and say, what actually impacts how you evaluate ideas and what is actually a good versus bad one and what's going to be the ones that most impact your organization, and to
Hmm.
get them to kind of slow down their thinking, their lay theories about what is a good or bad idea and where it comes from
Hmm.
versus the things they actually take action on. That has been a really important conversation.
Yeah.
And it extends beyond just like the empirical findings of this study to like, oh my God, like what all are the sorts of things that influence how I code the quality of good ideas,
Hmm.
and when could those theories really lead me astray?
All right. Well, I'm going to put a pin in that because I want to get back to that because that was one of the factors that I think applies to a trend that is eating every conversation we're having in management at the time. So I'm going to save that, get back to that in a second.
Okay.
I love thinking about surprises in the research process. So what you found, I think, is really important, but sometimes what you thought you'd find is different. And so you talk in particular about social proof and pro-social motivations as mechanisms, and that's I think one of the big draws of this is kind of the elegant, as you said, experiments that you guys ran that demonstrate these. Were there any surprises along the way as you were going through thinking about these studies, the revision process, times where the data may be pushed back on your expectations?
Yeah. So two, I think, quick anecdotes. One was honestly within the author team itself. We had a lot of debates about the mechanisms and the ones that I think were going to be most important, not only to explaining what we think are going on, but also important to just in terms of research design, get the paper kind of pushed through the review process. So in the paper itself, we talk about two classes of mechanisms. One is about sort of self-censorship. So one of the reasons why secondhand accounts may be actually supported more is firsthand accounts, you can kind of self-censor, and you may be afraid or not think your idea is good enough, and therefore you're not going to speak up about it. And that sort of self-censorship around firsthand accounts could not only diminish the likelihood that you're going to speak up about it, but it could also then impact how managers evaluate it. With
Hmm.
secondhand accounts, that self-censorship is even more important
Hmm.
because I'm not going to stick my neck out if, it's for a terrible idea, especially if it's impacting somebody else, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So that notion of self-censorship or censorship in general
Yeah.
is sort of one class for why secondhand accounts could have a different threshold for quality. But
Hmm.
to actually push this through the paper, it's really hard to get at the counterfactual of what ideas I would or would not have spoken up about in the past.
Mm.
And so then to think about that as an empirical setting for the archival study is fine, and the mechanism could be there.
Hmm.
But to then, orchestrate an entire paper with additional studies to really get at self-censorship would be really hard.
Okay.
So a second class of theories is irrespective of if there is some censoring going on, once the idea is spoken, once it's delivered to a manager, then a second class of theories starts to ask, well, how do managers then evaluate those ideas, even if, the quality, or in this case, the actual idea is identical? And there
Hmm.
are other factors besides just the words that are used or the idea itself that can impact how managers evaluate it. And so here, the source, so if it's first or second hand, could be one of those factors. So
Okay.
when you say like, the surprises or times where the data pushed back, like when you start off with a kind of a messy empirical setting, there's lots
Hmm.
of different potential mechanisms that could be there.
Yep.
And then within the author team, it's a lot of debate and then the construction of the research design to ultimately package something that we could sell
Yeah.
to an editor and set of reviewers. So that was one piece. The second piece where the data really pushed back was the result of our manipulation checks in one of our studies.
Hmm.
So it was a recall task. We asked people to think about a time where they spoke up on their own behalf, or again, the manipulation was, did you speak up on behalf of someone else? And
Hmm.
we expected people to then follow our instructions, recall that, and then, answer our set of questions.
Okay.
Well, where the data pushed back was it was just a lot harder for people to recall secondhand accounts. And so
Mm.
in that condition, they just didn't do it near as often. So in the paper, you'll see us reported a couple different ways. One is by our manipulation, which we find strong enough findings there.
Okay.
But then we actually then broke it down by what they actually recorded and, the instance of a secondhand account, which oftentimes was in reality a firsthand account.
Mm.
And then our findings actually became a lot stronger. And
I
so
see.
we actually reran that study a few times. Again, some of it's reported in the online appendices. And we just had, one hell of a time getting people to follow instructions and actually recall some of those instances. It's just not normative to think about the times where you spoke up purely on someone else's account.
Yeah.
Because most of the time you're like, hey, that's a good idea and it affects me too, so I'm going to do it as well.
Correct. Correct. All right. So maybe could you give an example of what you mean? I know you study voice for a long period of time, but what is an example of this recommendation that someone would make as a first hand versus a second hand? Is there like an example that you can think of?
So ones that we heard a lot, just doing some informal interviews to try and understand the phenomenon better. And this is certainly something that came out the last couple of years. You just think about like work-life balance issues and kind of flexible work policies.
Hmm.
This could be both remote type of issues, but it could also just be flexibility and taking off time to take care of whatever issues are going on at home. You can think about a person coming to their boss and saying, I need more flexibility because these are the issues that I'm dealing with. I have, a spouse I need to take care of at home or a aging parent or whatever, and I need this type of flexibility. The policy says X and I need Y. Can you help me work on it?
Mm.
And,
Okay.
it's something that directly affects me. But we also heard a number of instances where, colleagues talk to each other first, and all of a sudden one of them is like, man, this person is really struggling. So then I'm going to go to my boss and say, hey, I know our flexible work arrangements looks like this, but
Hmm.
my colleague is really experiencing this, hardship, and it would be much better if we could,
Okay.
change that in, ways X, Y, or Z in order to accommodate. And
Okay.
so it's the same issue. It's just, are you speaking up on your own behalf about that, or on someone else's?
Got it.
And we may get to this a little bit later, but that also brings, so that's kind of the cleanest manipulation.
Hmm.
And in the last study, we start to recognize that there's all sorts of nuances in how to do that. So
Yeah.
lots
Yeah.
of policies not only affect your colleague, it also affects you too. So,
Yep.
there's a little bit of nuance in gray area that, yeah,
Hmm.
I can speak up for someone else, but I could really be speaking up for myself too. And then does it affect one person? Does it affect many? Like there's all these nuances that we're able to tease out a little bit later when looking at the mechanisms.
Yeah, yeah. Like, what is it? Does true altruism actually exist, right? So, are you just being altruistic, or are you thinking like, well, if they get that, what are some indirect benefits that might impact me, and
Yep.
trying to separate those things out? All right. I like that. Okay, so that was those were the two surprising things. I was going to mention something else about the measurement of the mechanism, but I think because I want to get to this other topic, I'll see if I can wrap them up together. So the question
Good.
I wanted to ask as we expand this out a bit is whistleblowers
Mhm.
and compliance and like so. You guys used an internal reporting system as some of your data. I think there's they're becoming more and more popular now, often because of regulation and these sorts of things. And so I'm trying to think about your view of how organizations might think about this. And so if you have AI being used in this, and that's the topic that's eating all the conversations, like people are using this to like measure how valid a certain idea is, and our managers actually talking to other people, or are they just reading what's coming out? What do you think this means for how they should design things like compliance and audit functions that are specifically set up for people to give recommendations in voice? So, any recommendations for the firm that are designing these?
Yeah, I do think again, there's some nuance depending on what type of function you're talking about. So if you're looking just at compliance, that starts to bring in a lot of legal aspects as well, which I want
Okay.
to, make sure that we are very well attuned to that. So
Okay.
when you're running investigations, things like the source of where it comes from really shouldn't matter for how you run those investigations,
Hmm.
because there needs to be like very specific documentation for, issues around sexual harassment or discrimination that could ultimately end up as a court case.
Got
So
it.
I don't necessarily think the recommendation here is that for internal reporting systems and compliance functions and things that sort of have that legal twinge to it, that organizations should largely change how they manage those based solely on the source of where that information comes from.
Okay.
Because in all cases, they are due some pretty tight investigations and
Okay.
with a level of thoroughness and comprehensiveness.
Okay.
Now, I think compliance officers specifically, and then managers who are part of that process, need to be aware about how the source of those reports can then cloud and sort of change how they investigate.
Hmm.
But some of those like very specific steps that they undergo,
Hmm.
that should largely stay the same. But
Hmm.
this isn't the only type of, I'll say, voice function where this really surfaces. I mean, we
Yeah.
talked about internal report systems, but there's also more the water cooler conversation where you're speaking up directly to your boss, and many of those conversations happen long before it enters an internal compliance or internal reporting system,
Yeah.
and certainly then long before a whistleblowing type of situation where that person is going outside the organization
Hmm.
and no longer giving organization leaders an opportunity to take action.
Yeah.
And so, those water cooler conversations I also think matter a bunch. And this is why we really focus on sort of these managerial lay theories, because how they think about that source impacts how they then respond to those issues as they hear about them, even
Hmm.
before it gets into an internal reporting system. I also think this comes up for things like idea management systems. So if you're trying to discover, more innovative ideas, new product offerings, new services, new policies that need to get changed, that's not really an internal reporting system that again like has all these legal markers for investigation. It's more of a like, give me anything
Hmm.
that I can possibly use to make this organization better. And so understanding that the quality of idea is something that is separate from who offers it, I
Okay.
think is really important. So,
Yeah.
anonymizing it or taking those ideas and transforming it in a way so that all those ideas sort of have an even playing field, that they're
Mm.
able to be evaluated on their merits alone and not so much on, the source of that information, I
Yeah.
do think kind of lends itself to not just a more fair evaluation, but one that can ultimately surface better ideas.
Well, okay. So on that point, I think a lot about the messenger problem, particularly around highly polarized ideas. I mean, there was a time in 2021 where work from home or flexible work was a highly polarized
Yep.
idea. It was very, and so I'm wondering about the idea of, hey, should I advocate for something that I know impacts me? And will that be perceived by an audience as, well, this is just you're just being selfish. This is about you
Yep.
versus a messenger that's like, hey, this doesn't even actually affect me. This affects other people, but I still feel strongly. And so sometimes finding the right messenger or thinking about who is the right messenger for certain factors. And so, what do you think? How do you think your paper might impact how either groups within organizations or people who are interested in being advocates should think about their ideas? Taking what you have found as the way it is, maybe not the way it should be, but the way that it is. What should they take into account?
So when I talk with MBA students and executives on how to better sell their ideas, one of the caveats I get to give at the very beginning of those conversations is I am super instrumental now on how to sell your ideas. And to a large extent, we're going to talk through tactics that may not seem all that great for you.
Hmm.
And this, I think, is one great example. So, most of us, when we have an idea in our head, we think it's great. And so then it immediately comes out of our mouth. And that may not always be the best way to sell an idea. take it out of the first and second hand accounts for a second, like going back to one of Adam Grant's papers, he has a wonderful paper on emotional regulation, also an AMJ. Nice little plug for you there, Sekou.
Okay.
And what he basically finds is you need to have enough emotional intensity to want to stick your neck out, but not too much that you're going to piss everybody off in the process. And that emotional regulation is really important. And it's a kind of a fine line.
Uh-huh.
And so when we have that idea in our head and we think, oh my God, that's really great, and someone needs to know about this, and then we immediately go and speak up about it, that's not always the right time, because you have to ask, are you in the right sort of emotional state to deliver that message? And I think the issue with first and second hand accounts is sort of the same thing. It's my idea. I think it's great. I want to speak up about it, and I also want credit for it. And so the thing that I've had to push students around is, do you want credit for this, or do you actually want to enact change? And so you are not always in the best position to deliver the idea that you have. You have to think tactically about who is the best messenger for this idea. And at least what our research suggests is those firsthand accounts, it has to be a really good idea. Because if it impacts you, they're going to have that twinge of a question. Are you just speaking up about this because it's going to positively impact you and you alone? And when that's there, you're stacking the deck against yourself. Yeah. And so, again, what I've found, and this is more anecdotal than anything else, not in the paper, not supported empirically. Most people will say, hey, I have this idea and we all think it's really good. And that invokes that element of social proof, that it's not just me, it's like a whole mess of people also think this is great and it's impacting us all. But that's not always the best tactic. And so, think about who's well connected to your boss or whoever else is you're pitching it to, and see if they're actually better positioned to enact influence on executives to enact change.
Yeah. All right. That's beautiful. Okay. Last kind of big picture question. And this goes to the gap between what managers believe and what they do. So one of the provocative findings in your paper is that their stated beliefs and how they evaluate voice diverges from how they actually evaluate it. And so, as we think about evidence-based management and this very strong analytics bent, and you and I both kind of dabble in this quite deeply, is this paper making an argument towards more auditing of managerial decisions? It almost feels, you were mentioning this with your idea thing, like maybe things need to be transformed so that the verbiage and the source is maybe hidden from the managers, but at the same time, a manager wants that autonomy. And so how do we think about it from a managerial perspective? I want to make good decisions. I don't want my lay theory and my behaviors to be different. How do you think about bringing those together?
Yeah. So if I was talking to executives about this, again, anytime there's a gap between what I think I'll do and what I actually do, to me, that requires those managers to take a pause. It requires them to slow their thinking so they can really evaluate if this is really due to, in this case, the source of information, or is it really a function of the quality of idea for what actions I'm ultimately going to take. And so I do think there's some kind of simple tips and tricks if you're just talking to like one person rather than trying to change systems. And that's to ask a few quick questions. If this idea came up and it wasn't this person who offered it, does that change how I think about it? Well, if that answer is yes, then that's pretty instructive for how you should then think and evaluate it and, continue to stress test it and see if it's something you want to take action on. And again, to kind of broaden this out beyond this paper, like I suggest those things all the time. Is the idea framed as, here's the new best idea, or there's going to be impending doom if we don't take action on this? And it can be the very same idea, but if you just change the frame, you may think about that idea a little bit differently. And so it's kind of is more playing with the idea itself,
Okay.
shifting it around, shifting the source, shifting how it's framed, shifting the impact of it to really get at is this of high quality among all the priorities that we have as an organization? How does this actually then stack up to a bunch of others? Because
Hmm.
it's, you know, for managers, it's not really a matter of is this good or bad. Like
Hmm.
there's lots of great ideas across all the organization.
Correct. Yeah.
It's really a matter of prioritization. Is this going to meet like the threshold of like the three things that we really need to take on as a whole?
Yep.
And some of these small little nuances and how it's framed or the source or whatever can change things at the margin and actually flip some of the prioritization. And so you want to make sure you get those top three things right, not necessarily like evaluate is this good or bad from, a threshold of 1,000 ideas. You're not going to be able to implement 1,000 of them.
Got it. All right. Well, if you are out there and you are a manager and you need some help with making decisions, Ethan Burris would love to come to speak with you one-on-one. His email is posted because he's at a public university, and so just email him. Just email him.
I'm going to help every single person via email. This is great. Thank you, Sekou.
I do what I can. You don't do enough, so I figured. All right, last two questions to take you out. What are the sorts of behaviors and things that are piquing your curiosity right now? What are you thinking about in the future? It's like some ideas. Maybe you don't even have a research around it yet, but just something that you have an eye on that you're like, huh, that's interesting.
So this. I've spent the last couple of years in the dean's office and more administrative roles, and I think this extends beyond just higher education. But higher education is certainly having a moment in the broader ethos of what's happening across society. But then there's all these other sets of issues too, and I've been thinking a lot about how speaking up about these types of politically charged issues also seems to be different now than even in times in the past. You go back to speaking of unethical practices like Nixon, White House, or civil rights movement, or all these things that where there were some pretty serious times then too, and lots of civil unrest. But I also think to a larger extent, the last couple of decades, we've lived in a relative time of peace, and that seems to be more on edge now compared to what we lived through in certainly in the 90s and somewhat in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I do think there's a lot of differences in speaking truth to power in that way that is a bit different than speaking up to truth to power inside a workplace. And, this extends beyond just lower level employees, but even CEOs and executives as they then interface with those very same kind of politicians. That's something that's very present on my mind. I have not cracked that nut at all.
Yeah.
But that's probably more than any other questions. Those are the types of questions I've gotten in the last 5-6 years,
Yep.
and those are the toughest ones to actually answer with, I think, the body of knowledge we have.
Yeah. No, I love that. I'm knee deep in political ideology and how it mashes up with organizational stuff. And I find it fascinating in a bunch of different ways. I also find that there's not nearly enough kind of, I think, deep reflective thinking about these topics. It's more like, how do I solve this immediate problem? And I think it might be time for kind of a significant look back at, all right, well, this isn't the first time we've had political tumult in
Yep.
society, and what can we learn and what can we think, and so those sorts of things. So, all right, so I look forward to that AMJ that you'll probably start writing as soon as we get off this call. Anything that you're reading for fun right now, not papers, not Adam Grant papers, for fun.
Well, I just finished a book, so I'm right in between books.
Okay.
I just finished a book, and as I finished it, Sekou, so I'll give a little plug for this. This totally reminded me of our old book club when you're at UT Austin.
Yeah.
And it's the acronym of this book club was called the Lab. And I'll let Sekou tell everyone what the Lab actually stands for.
I'm not going to. I've forgotten. I think it's learned academics and books. I think that was what it was.
Oh,
But
is that what it
continue.
was?
But continue. Yeah, I'm
All
sure
right.
that's what it was. Go, Ethan, please.
So all listeners, next Academy in Philly, seek out Sekou for the real deal on that. So I finished this book and it reminded me because it was a fascinating story, fascinating tale, and then lots of avenues to, debate the good and bad of it. And it was a book called The Hank Show. And it's about this guy named Hank Asher. Fascinating guy. I mean, like quirky to all get out and absolutely brilliant. But he's also a person with incredible flaws. And he made a lot of money, impacted society in a lot of ways for the good, but also it's complicated and not all of it's great. So here's the short of it.
Yeah.
Really driven guy. He started a painting company in Florida, like either during or right out of college, just to make a bunch of money. He kind of cornered the market there. Got bored. Met a few other folks. Eventually started flying airplanes. Ended up running drugs from the Bahamas into Florida.
Okay.
Almost got caught. Was like, this isn't the life for me anymore. Then started learning computer programming. This is back in the 80s. And just had a knack for it. And make a long story short, he started programming systems and with hardware stuff that he kind of made up on his own to then assemble lots of data sets together and sort of piece them together. And he was able to then kind of sell these data sets to like police officers and precincts to essentially help find folks, because a lot of this was through the Bureau of Motor Vehicles for each of the states. But again, to make a long story short, when you start piecing all these data sets together, it eventually became things that undergird companies like TransUnion and Experian and then LexisNexis. And, so you have like one person who has an ID number, and then all their data from all these various sources are then shoved together.
Yeah.
And the thing that was fascinating about him is, he's brilliant, but he was acerbic and just a jerk for a lot of folks. So he would build these companies and eventually tick everyone off that they would boot him out. And then he would wait for a non-compete to expire, and then he would do it all over again and kill his old company, build up a new one, and the whole thing would start over. After 9/11, he helped the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security actually find some of the terrorist networks because he had information on all of them.
Wow.
And gave that stuff out for free. Still gave all of his stuff to police organizations for free. But, it's complicated because it also leads to things like Cambridge Analytica, which he helped, and Facebook and all that kind of stuff. And it was just a really fascinating and incredibly scary story of not only this individual, but like the societal implications of how data are used and stuff like that. So highly recommend.
The Hank Show.
The Hank Show.
5 out of 5 by Ethan Burris on Goodreads. Thank you for that. That's good. You might have given away too much because now I know what he did.
Oh, no, I didn't.
No? Oh, wow.
There's more.
Oh, smokes. Okay. All right. Well done. Well, Ethan, thank you very much for that. I do miss lab. I do miss reading books and having discussions with you about them over a glass or two of wine. And I look forward to being able to do that again one day. Thanks again for your time. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Sekou.
All right, that's it for the Lit Review. I appreciate Ethan for his time. It's great chatting with him. And I appreciate you all for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Lit Review podcast. You can find us by searching The Lit Review, an AMJ podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, as well as on the AMJ homepage. Thank you to the Academy of Management for their support of this podcast. Special thanks, as always, to my producer, Holly Fearing, for all of her work behind the scenes. Our theme music is produced by Key to Life. This is Sekou Burmis. See you next time. Take care and be good.